Look at the casualty list again, Admiral. Right there. Second page, third name from the bottom. Commander Reyes, Catherine A. Missing, presumed lost. Helicopter gone into the Arabian Sea 4 days ago. And that chair at the end of the table, the one nobody wanted to sit in this morning, that chair belongs to her. The room was quiet, in the particular way that rooms full of military professionals get quiet when something has gone wrong and nobody has found the words yet. It was the quiet of a briefing room aboard a Fifth Fleet command vessel in the Strait of Hormuz, in the 5th day of July 2026, when the summer heat pressed down on the water like a physical weight, and the air smelled of recycled coolant, and the particular anxiety of people who hold large responsibilities and small amounts of sleep. The overhead lights were precise and cold. The table was long and dark, and surrounded by men and women in khaki and service dress blue, captains and commodores, and one rear admiral whose name was Whitmore, and whose face, in that moment, was a careful, controlled mask over something that was not quite grief, but was near enough to it to matter. There were 11 chairs around that table. 10 of them were occupied. The casualty list had gone around that morning. It had gone around the task force. It had gone around the Fifth Fleet. It had, in the way of these things, gone around in ways that exceeded any official channel, because human beings in proximity to loss do not wait for official channels. They talk in passageways and on flight decks, and over coffee that goes cold before it is drunk. They trade fragments of information the way people have always traded fragments, trying to assemble from the pieces something that makes sense, some shape that their minds can hold. The fragments about Commander Catherine Reyes were not comforting. The helicopter, a Navy MH-60S that had been operating as part of a routine maritime surveillance rotation, had gone down in the early hours of July 5th. The sea state had been 3, not catastrophic, but not gentle. The water temperature in that part of the Arabian Sea in July is warm enough to support survival, but not kind enough to guarantee it. The search had gone on for 4 days. The search teams had found wreckage, they had found debris, they had not found Commander Reyes. And so her name had migrated, with the terrible bureaucratic efficiency of military tragedy, from the duty roster to the casualty list. Her chair at the planning table had remained empty through 2 previous briefings. Nobody had moved it. Nobody had suggested moving it. There are some things that military professionals understand without being told, and one of them is that you do not move the chair. Rear Admiral Whitmore looked at the empty chair for a moment. Then he looked at his watch. Then he opened the folder in front of him and began to speak. He had gotten approximately 4 words into his opening when the door at the back of the room opened. Not the main hatch. The secondary door, the one that led to the passageway from the aft ladder well, the one that, in the normal course of a briefing, nobody used because everyone was already seated before the admiral arrived. Someone was using it now. The sound was what they noticed first. The soft but distinct sound of boot heels on the deck. A measured, unhurried cadence. Not the brisk stride of someone rushing in late, embarrassed and apologetic. Something quieter than that. Something that had no apology in it at all. She was wearing a flight suit. The flight suit was a standard olive-drab Navy aviator's issue, the kind that exists in 1,000 lockers on 100 ships, and yet there was nothing standard about the way this one looked. It had been in the sea. The salt had dried into it, and left its mark along the collar and the cuffs, and the upper chest in the white crystalline patterns that salt water leaves on dark fabric when it evaporates in heat. The survival kit harness was still buckled across her chest, the way you leave it buckled when you don't know whether you're going to need it again in the next 10 minutes, and you've decided that the mathematics of the situation favor keeping it on. There was a line on her right forearm that might have been a cut or might have been a scrape from something in the water, faded now to the yellowish edge of a bruise beginning to heal. Her hair was pulled back with the functional severity of a person who has had no time and no inclination to think about her hair for 4 days. Her face was tanned a shade darker than it had been a week ago, the way faces get when they have been exposed to open water and open sky, and nothing between them and the sun but the thin protection of a flight suit's collar. Her eyes were the gray-green of the Arabian Sea at dawn. Calm. Completely, absolutely calm. She walked to the empty chair at the end of the table. She pulled it out. She sat down. She placed on the table in front of her a folded chart, the paper heavy and slightly swollen at the edges, the way paper gets when it has been wet and then dried in the heat. She smoothed it once with the flat of her hand. Then she looked up at Rear Admiral Whitmore and said, in a voice that carried clearly in the silent room, but was not raised above a conversational volume, "Sir, before you continue, has the task force given any consideration to the shallow water corridor at grid reference November Foxtrot 773? The search teams appear to have been concentrating their pattern further east." The room did not breathe. Admiral Whitmore, who had been in the Navy for 31 years and who had stood on the bridge of a cruiser during a live mine engagement and who did not rattle easily, looked at the woman sitting at the end of his briefing table for a long moment. Then he stood up. He was the senior officer in the room. When a rear admiral stands up in a briefing, the protocol is that everyone else stands up too. They did. All 10 of them, in a scraping of chairs and a rustle of uniform fabric, rising to their feet without being entirely certain why, responding to something in the moment that bypassed the usual chain of conscious decision. Commander Catherine Reyes did not stand. She was already sitting in her own chair. "Commander Reyes," Admiral Whitmore said. "Admiral," she tilted her head very slightly in acknowledgement. "You," the Admiral said, and then paused, and then started again. "The casualty list. I'm aware of the casualty list, sir. You've been in the water for 4 days. 3 days, 21 hours, approximately. I had a functioning watch." She paused. "The watch is still running. The chronometer function was useful." The Commodore to the Admiral's left, a man named Ferris, who ran surface warfare operations and who had not gotten more than 5 hours of sleep in the last 3 days, partly because of the ongoing search for the woman now sitting at the end of this table, sat back down slowly in his chair. He was not doing this because protocol required it. He was doing it because his legs had decided, without consulting the rest of him, that sitting was the appropriate response to what was happening. "Commander," Admiral Whitmore said, and his voice had changed. It had dropped the careful administrative distance that senior officers maintain in briefings as a matter of professional discipline. It had become something closer to the voice of a man who has been running a search and who is now confronting the object of that search, sitting in front of him in a salt-dried flight suit with a chart. "How?" "Life raft," she said. "Standard issue. I was able to exit the aircraft before it went under. I had approximately 40 seconds. She paused. The pilot did not have the same opportunity. "Lieutenant Commander Yates. He is on the list for the right reasons, sir. I want to be clear about that." A silence. "I'm sorry," the Admiral said. "Yes, sir." She said it without elaboration. Then she looked back down at the chart. "The corridor," she said. "Grid reference November Foxtrot 773. I had 4 days to look at the sea in that area from a vantage point that the search aircraft didn't have, which was surface level. I had this." She unfolded the chart with careful hands. It was a navigation chart, hand-drawn in the margins and along the coast markers in a fine, precise pencil. The kind of detailed annotation that someone makes when they have a pencil and a chart, and 4 days, and a very clear professional motive to pay attention to their surroundings. This is the patrol pattern of Iranian fast boats in that sector over a 72-hour window. I was watching them from the raft. I was, in the absence of other occupation, keeping a log. She touched the chart with one finger. There's a gap, here, approximately 6 nautical miles wide, running northeast to southwest, between the 17-meter and 30-meter bathymetric lines. The fast boats do not cross into it. They approach it and turn. Every time. She looked up. I don't know whether it's a navigation hazard I'm not aware of, a standing order I'm not privy to, or a logistics gap in their rotation cycle. But it's consistent, and it's real, and I've had 4 days to verify it. She folded her hands on the chart. If it's a patrol gap, she said, it changes the escort geometry for the carrier passage scheduled for next week. You could route the task group through the corridor during the window between 2200 and 0200 local. The fast boats don't operate in that sector during that window either. I logged that separately. She touched another notation on the chart. I had time. Admiral Whitmore looked at the chart. He looked at the woman who had made it from a life raft in the Arabian Sea, across 4 days and 3 nights. He looked at the chart again. Then he looked at his intelligence officer, a commander named Hollister, who was sitting very still, with the expression of a person who is recalibrating a significant number of assumptions simultaneously. "Commander Hollister," the admiral said, "what do we have on that grid reference?" Hollister was already opening his laptop. His fingers moved across the keys with a focused urgency. The room waited. The air recyclers hummed. Someone's coffee cup sat untouched and cooling on the table to Reyes's left, and nobody touched it. "We have," Hollister said slowly, and then stopped, and then looked up. "We have imagery consistent with reduced activity in that corridor, sir. We flagged it as a data gap, potential sensor limitation. We did not flag it as a patrol gap." He paused. "The bathymetric data for that sector shows a rocky shelf at the 16 to 19-meter depth range, possible submerged obstruction. It would be consistent with fast boats avoiding it on surface patrol." He looked at Commander Reyes. "If they're operating on standing orders to avoid the shelf, the window between 2200 and 0200 local coincides with the shift change at their nearest base, reduced operational tempo." He looked back at the admiral. "Sir, this is confirmable with the assets we have. This is an intelligence product." "It's a chart," Commander Reyes said mildly. "I had a pencil." She said it without pride. She said it the way a carpenter might say, "It's a nail," when someone compliments the straightness of a joint. It was a statement of materials. It was not a boast. If stories like this mean something to you, the kind that come from real darkness and real patience, you can help keep them coming on Patreon. The link is right there in the description. The briefing did not stop. The room did not take a break to process what had happened in the way that civilians in a civilian meeting might take a break. Military briefings have a momentum and a necessity and an irreversibility about them that does not pause for the extraordinary unless the extraordinary has rendered the briefing irrelevant. This extraordinary thing had not rendered the briefing irrelevant. It had in fact made it more relevant. It had walked through the door and sat down and handed the intelligence officer a 72-hour hand-logged patrol pattern from a life raft in the Strait of Hormuz. The briefing continued. Commander Reyes participated in it with the focused precision of a person who has been thinking about these questions for 4 days and who has a significant number of specific observations to offer. She was, in the flat professional language of naval intelligence assessments, a primary source. She was also, in the more complicated human language of this room and this moment, a woman who had been listed as missing and presumed lost, and who was now sitting at the table in a salt-dried flight suit, contributing actionable intelligence to a briefing that had been proceeding without her. She asked, at one point, for a cup of coffee. Someone got her one. She said thank you and did not elaborate. It was during the third segment of the briefing, as the operations officer was walking through the revised escort geometry based on Reyes's corridor data, that Captain Hargreaves, who commanded the surface warfare element of the task force and who was sitting 2 chairs to the Admiral's right, became aware that he had been staring at Commander Reyes for approximately 6 minutes without looking away. He became aware of this because the operations officer said his name twice before he responded. What Hargreaves was thinking, as he had been staring, was something that was not entirely organized into words yet, but was working toward them. It was something about the chart on the table, about the fact that the chart was a standard navigation chart of the kind that every naval aircraft carries, the kind that exists as backup in a survival kit for situations in which electronic navigation fails or is unavailable. It was the kind of chart that very few people in situations of survival in open water have the presence of mind to retrieve from a sinking aircraft. Because retrieving a chart from a sinking aircraft requires you to make a decision while the aircraft is sinking about what is worth reaching for and what is not. And then it was something about the pencil, about the fact that someone in a life raft in the Arabian Sea in July, in heat that would be somewhere between 38 and 42 degrees Celsius during the daylight hours, with whatever physical condition she was in after a helicopter crash into open water, had decided to log patrol patterns. Had decided not merely to survive, which was its own extraordinary thing, but to use the time. Had decided, with 4 days of water horizon and Iranian fast boats and open sky and God knows what kind of fear and exhaustion and grief about Lieutenant Commander Yates, to pay attention. To maintain a log. In pencil. On a chart she'd pulled from a sinking aircraft. Hargreaves thought about what he had been doing for the last 4 days. He had been doing his job. He had been doing it under stress, with inadequate sleep, managing the operational demands of a complex task force environment, while the background fact of a missing officer ran as a persistent low-frequency signal under everything else. He had been doing a creditable job of it. He knew that. He looked at the chart on the table. He thought about what it would have taken to produce that chart. He went back to paying attention to the operations officer, because that was his job and the briefing was ongoing. But something in him had shifted. Some calibration had been adjusted. The room felt different to him than it had felt 45 minutes ago when he had walked in. Not because anything dramatic had happened, not because anyone had done anything theatrical or performed anything for effect. A woman had walked in through a door and sat down in her chair and asked whether anyone had looked at a particular grid reference. The drama of it was entirely in the facts. The facts were doing all the work. After the briefing, there were logistics. There are always logistics. Commander Reyes was escorted to the ship's medical bay, not because she appeared to be in immediate distress, but because 4 days in a life raft in the Arabian Sea represents a physiological event that the Navy takes seriously, and that the ship's medical officer wanted to assess with his own instruments rather than his own eyes. She walked to the medical bay with the same unhurried, measured cadence with which she had walked into the briefing room. The corpsman who met her at the hatch, a 23-year-old hospital corpsman second class named Diaz, looked at her flight suit and her salt-line collar and her still-buckled harness and managed to maintain a professional composure that he would later privately describe to his rackmate as the hardest thing he had done since joining the Navy. She allowed herself to be examined. She sat on the exam table with the patience of a person who understands that this is a necessary procedure and who has sufficient experience with necessary procedures to proceed through them without drama. Her blood pressure was low, but not critically so. Her hydration levels, the medical officer told her, were better than he would have expected, given the conditions. And she told him that she had rationed the survival kit water supply on a precise schedule, and had also recovered approximately 2 liters of fresh water from condensation on the raft's canopy during the cooler nighttime hours. She said this as though it were an obvious thing. The medical officer wrote it down. The cut on her forearm required 3 sutures. She watched him place them with the same calm attention with which she had watched the fast boat patrol patterns from the surface of the Arabian Sea. When he was done, he told her she needed rest, food, and at least 6 hours in a rack before she was cleared for duty. She agreed that this was medically sound and told him she would be back for a follow-up examination in the morning. Then she asked whether her chart had been properly secured. The medical officer told her he didn't know. She asked if he could find out. He found out. It had been photographed, digitized, transmitted to fleet intelligence, and cross-referenced with satellite imagery within 30 minutes of the end of the briefing. She said that was good, and that she would like the original back when fleet intelligence was finished with it. She said this the way you say something when you are not asking for permission but are providing information about your intentions. In the passageway outside the medical bay, the ship's command master chief, a man named Okafor, who had been in the Navy for 24 years and who had seen a significant number of things in those 24 years, was waiting. He was waiting because Admiral Whitmore had asked him to wait, and also because he had wanted to wait anyway. Commander Reyes came through the hatch and saw him. "Master Chief," she said. "Commander," he said. And then he said, "Welcome back, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment. There were things in that moment that were not said in words and did not need to be said in words. There was the weight of 4 days. There was the weight of a name on a casualty list and a chair that nobody had moved. There was the weight of Lieutenant Commander Yates, who had not made it to the life raft and who was on the list for the right reasons, and whose 40 seconds had not been the same as her 40 seconds. There was the weight of a pencil moving across a navigation chart in the heat of a life raft in the Strait of Hormuz. "Thank you, Master Chief," she said. He stepped aside. She walked toward the berthing. The chart, in the meantime, was doing what Commander Reyes had intended it to do. The intelligence officer, Commander Hollister, spent the 4 hours after the briefing in the intelligence spaces with 2 analysts and a stack of satellite imagery that had previously been assessed as inconclusive. It was not inconclusive anymore. The hand-logged patrol pattern that Reyes had maintained from the life raft provided a template against which the satellite data could be re-examined. And when you examined the satellite data against that template, things that had previously looked like sensor artifacts or data gaps began to look like something else. They began to look like a consistent and systematic avoidance of a particular corridor by Iranian fast boat patrol elements over a window that had been, until approximately 4 hours ago, completely invisible to fleet intelligence. Hollister sent a preliminary assessment to 5th Fleet Headquarters at 22:47 local time. He classified the source as Humint, which was technically accurate. The source was a human being. The human being had been in a life raft. At 5th Fleet Headquarters in Bahrain, the preliminary assessment landed on the desk of a Rear Admiral named Cho, who was the Fleet Intelligence Director, and who read it twice and then read it a third time, and then asked his aide to confirm that he was reading it correctly, specifically the part about the source. His aide confirmed that he was reading it correctly, specifically the part about the source. Rear Admiral Cho sat for a moment with the assessment in his hand. Then he picked up his phone and called Rear Admiral Whitmore, who was still awake. "Tom," Cho said. "Kevin," Whitmore said. "This assessment from your task force intelligence." "Yes." "The source." "Yes." A pause. 4 days, Cho said. 4 days, Whitmore confirmed. She maintained a log. In pencil. Another pause. The corridor assessment. Cho said. If we confirm this, and I think we can confirm this, it changes the routing matrix for the carrier passage. I know. And the window she identified checks out against the shift change data. I know. Tom, Cho said, your casualty list is being revised, Whitmore said. The casualty list was, in fact, being revised. This was a process that involved administrative steps and official notifications and corrections to records that had been created in the assumption of loss. It was a process that took several hours to complete through the appropriate channels. While it was being completed, certain things happened that were not administrative. The crew of the carrier, which was operating approximately 40 nautical miles from the command ship, and which had received the casualty list through the same informal channels that all such information travels, learned at some point in the late evening that Commander Reyes was not on the list anymore in the way that she had been on the list. That she was on the ship, that she had walked into a briefing in a salt-dried flight suit and handed the intelligence officer a patrol pattern. The information moved through the carrier the way that a certain kind of information moves through a large ship when a certain kind of thing has happened, which is to say, it moved instantly and in all directions simultaneously, and in forms that outran any official announcement by several hours. The flight deck crews talked about it. The maintenance crews talked about it. The pilots in the ready room, some of whom had flown search patterns over the area where the helicopter had gone down, talked about it with a particular intensity that had in it both relief and something more complicated, the specific complicated feeling of people who have been searching for someone and who have now processed the information that the searching is no longer necessary. Commander Hollister, in his intelligence spaces, talked about it with his analysts, one of whom was a young ensign on her first deployment who had never met Commander Reyes and who had been running search probability calculations for 4 days. The ensign was quiet for a moment after Hollister told her. Then she asked what the chart looked like. Hollister pulled it up on his screen. The ensign looked at the hand-drawn patrol tracks, the precise notation of times and bearings, the careful marking of the bathymetric boundary where the fast boats turned. She did that from a life raft, the ensign said. Yes, Hollister said. The ensign looked at it for another moment. What kind of pencil do they put in the survival kits? She asked. I don't actually know, Hollister said. He found out later. It was a standard number 2 pencil, yellow, the kind that you might find in any office supply drawer anywhere in the world. It was water-resistant in the way that pencil graphite is water-resistant, which is to say, it does not wash off when wet. This turned out to be relevant. The following morning, Commander Reyes reported to the medical officer for her follow-up examination as agreed. Her numbers had improved. He cleared her for light duty. She thanked him and went to find her chart. It had been returned as promised. She looked at it for a moment in the intelligence spaces, this thing that she had made in the particular circumstances that she had made it in, and then she folded it carefully along its original fold lines and put it in the breast pocket of the fresh flight suit she had been issued. Admiral Whitmore met with her in his sea cabin at 0900. The meeting was not long. He told her that the corridor assessment was being incorporated into the carrier passage routing and that Fleet Intelligence was treating it as a primary intelligence product of significant operational value. He told her that the preliminary findings had already been shared with the relevant commands and that additional assets were being tasked to refine the picture she had provided. She said she was glad it was useful. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Commander, I've been in this Navy for 31 years. I've seen a great deal. I want you to know that what you did, the survival and the log, and the way you walked in yesterday is something I will not forget." She was quiet for a moment. "We lost Yates, sir," she said. "I know. He had 11 years in. He was a good officer and a good pilot, and he was going to make commander in the next cycle. I'd already written his evaluation. I know. I want to make sure that's part of whatever record is kept of this. It will be, Whitmore said. I give you my word. She nodded. She said nothing more about it. There was nothing more to say that the Admiral could not be trusted to say in the appropriate places. She asked when she could return to flight status. He told her the medical officer would need to clear her for flight duty specifically. She said she was aware of that and would pursue it through the appropriate process. He told her he would not stand in the way of that process. She said she appreciated that. She stood, and he stood, and she rendered a salute that was correct and clean, and he returned it with a precision that he had not used on a salute in some years, because this was the kind of moment that called for precision. He sat for a moment at his desk. Outside the port, the Strait of Hormuz was running green-blue in the morning light, and somewhere out there, at grid reference November Foxtrot 773, there was a gap in a patrol pattern that a woman in a life raft had spent 4 days watching with a pencil and a navigation chart. He picked up his pen and began writing. In the weeks that followed, the corridor assessment proved out. The routing adjustment for the carrier passage, built on the framework that Reyes had drafted from the life raft, went off without incident. The carrier and its escorts moved through the gap in the fast boat patrol pattern during the identified window. They were not intercepted. They were not harassed. They moved through with the smooth, unhurried efficiency of a force that knows where the holes in the fence are. The intelligence community formalized the assessment. The satellite imagery was reanalyzed in light of Reyes's template and produced a refined operational picture of Iranian fast boat patrol rhythms in that sector that became a reference product for subsequent fleet operations. The analysts credited the primary source in the proper place in the formal product. The primary source was listed as HUMINT, collected during sustained observation over a 72-hour period from a surface-level platform in the area of operations. The surface-level platform was a life raft. In the ready rooms and the intelligence spaces and the passageways of the task force ships, the story moved in the way that certain stories move through military organizations, which is with a speed and a fidelity that official communications cannot match. It moved because people needed it to move. Not because it was sensational, though it was extraordinary, but because it said something that military people know and need to be reminded of in the particular kind of way that only a real example can provide. It said that competence does not announce itself. It does not require favorable circumstances or optimal conditions or an audience. It does not require anything to be easy. It requires only the willingness to pay attention to the problem in front of you and to use whatever you have available to address it. A pencil, a chart, a window of 72 hours during which you are also doing the other thing, which is surviving, and which is enough of a job on its own, but which turns out not to be incompatible with the first thing. The young ensign in Hollister's intelligence spaces thought about it often in the months after. She thought about it when she was tired, which was often. She thought about it when a problem looked intractable, and the data was incomplete, and the available tools seemed insufficient to the task. She had developed a habit, which she knew was somewhat eccentric, but which she had decided she did not care about being eccentric, of keeping a standard number 2 pencil on her desk, alongside the banks of sophisticated intelligence hardware that constituted her primary working environment. She did not explain the pencil to people who asked about it. She just said it was useful. Other people in the task force had their own ways of carrying the story. A petty officer on the carrier's flight deck, a plane captain named Rourke, who had run one of the visual search patterns over the area on day 2 of the search, told the story to every new sailor he trained on aircraft handling. He told it as a story about paying attention, about not letting the situation tell you what's possible, about the specific value of looking at a problem from a different angle, even if the different angle was not the angle you would have chosen. The chart itself resided in Commander Reyes's file, and also in the Fleet Intelligence Archives, and also, though this was not official, in the memory of everyone who had been in that briefing room when the secondary hatch opened and a woman in a salt-dried flight suit walked to the empty chair that nobody had moved and sat down and asked about a grid reference. Admiral Whitmore retired 2 years later. At his retirement ceremony, he gave a short speech that covered the usual territory: the years of service, the gratitude, the acknowledgement of colleagues and family. Near the end, he paused, and he said that, in 33 years of naval service, he had seen many extraordinary things, and that the most extraordinary were often the quietest. He did not elaborate. The people in the room, who had been on the command ship in July of 2026, did not need him to elaborate. The people who had not been there found themselves, in the days after, wanting to ask what he had meant. Some of them found out. The story, when they heard it, had the quality that all such stories have when they are true or true enough, which is that the details are so specific and so unadorned that they resist embellishment. There is nothing to add. The woman had a pencil. She had a chart. She had 4 days. She logged what she saw. The rest is in the record. Commander Catherine Reyes was promoted to captain 18 months after the Hormuz incident. Her promotion board file contained, in the appropriate section for significant operational contributions, a citation regarding her development of an intelligence product under, the document's careful language noted, austere field conditions. The citation mentioned the corridor assessment and its operational impact. It did not fully convey what austere field conditions meant in this case, because the conventions of official citation language are not built for the particular kind of austere that involves a life raft and a survival kit pencil and the Arabian Sea in July. People who had been there knew what it meant. People who had not been there and who read the citation sometimes wondered about the phrase but did not always pursue it. Those who pursued it found the story. Those who found the story tended to remember it. That is how these things work. The memory moves from person to person across the years, changing slightly in the way that memory changes, accumulating small additions and losing small specifics, but retaining the core because the core is hard to lose. The core is simple. A woman was listed as dead. She walked into the room. She had been paying attention. She had a pencil. She had, in 4 days on the Arabian Sea, done the thing that distinguishes the professionals from everyone else. She had refused to let circumstances determine what was possible. She had looked at what she had, and she had found a use for it. The pencil was a number 2, standard issue. The chart was paper. Paper survives salt water if it dries. These are facts. The gap in the patrol pattern was real. The corridor was real. The carrier passed through it. That is also in the record. When new officers arrived at Fifth Fleet in the years that followed, there were various things they were told. They were told about procedures and protocols and chain of command and the specific operational realities of the Hormuz environment. They were told, when the moment seemed right, which was not always, about a night in July 2026 when a briefing was in progress and a door opened. The ones who heard it tended to listen without interrupting. They tended to ask, when it was finished, the same questions. Did she really maintain a log? She really maintained a log. What kind of pencil? Number 2, standard issue. And then they tended to be quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of quiet that settles over people who have just been given something they are going to carry for a while. That is the story. That is what happened in the Strait of Hormuz in July of 2026, in a briefing room on a command ship, when the second door opened and the empty chair was filled. The rest, the log, the chart, the corridor, The carrier's safe passage is a matter of record. The part that is not in any record is the look on the faces of the people in that room when they understood what they were seeing. But those people remember it, and they have told others, and those others have told others after them. That is how quiet competence survives, not in the noise of its own announcement, but in the memory of the people who were there when it walked through the door. For more stories where the quiet professional walks into the room and the room changes, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. And if you'd like to help me keep telling them, you'll find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.